Welcome to Cabeza de Vaca. Episode 14, The Great Escape. I'm Brandon Seale. If you've ever picked prickly pears, you know that they're nasty little things. To pick them, first you have to weave your arm through the larger thorns of the cactus itself, but that's actually the easy part. Because once you reach the fluorescent pink fruit, there's a much more sinister surprise waiting for you. The fruit itself, you see, is covered with tiny, almost furry little spines that seem to jump out and burrow themselves deep into your fingers. And then, when you go to pull the spines out, more often than not, they leave behind their toxic little barbs, which leaves you feeling the spines even long after they're gone. Running a torch over the fruits helps knock down the little spines, and I've seen ranch hands brush them off with a handful of grass. But even using these hacks, if you spend a day picking prickly pears, you will spend a week picking the pricklies out of your hand. And what's your reward for all this unpleasantness? A fruit that is mostly seeds, that is neither particularly sweet nor particularly tart, and that even then you can't really eat without roasting or boiling it. Oh, and did I mention when the prickly pears ripen? In August, in South Texas, when there is no water around. Which is to say that when paleo communities were out there picking prickly pears, they were doing so as much to stay hydrated as to stay fed. And this was the time of year that South Texas Indians looked forward to most. In the hungriest of times, they consoled themselves with fantasies about how full their bellies would be in the summer months after they traveled to the great prickly pear ranges and ate their fill. Yet Álvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca, Alonso Castillo, Andrés Dorantes, and Esteban had another reason to look forward to the prickly pear harvest, or tunal in Spanish, of 1534. They planned to use the tunal to make their escape. These tunals were great social events. A general peace fell upon a land otherwise engaged in constant war. People used the tunal to arrange marriages, to perform religious ceremonies, and to conduct trade. It was perhaps the only time of year when the land offered sufficient bounty to allow for some leisure time for these long-suffering foragers and to support large movements of people. It attracted tribes from all over South Texas and northern Mexico, including the bands with whom Cabeza de Vaca, Castillo, Dorantes, and Esteban had been living the past year. A year earlier, during the prickly pear harvest of 1533, the four former Narvaez expeditionaries were just days away from effecting their escape when the band keeping them tore itself apart in a fit of infighting. The native band broke up and dispersed, splitting up the four castaways, frustrating their escape plans, and consigning them to yet another year of slavery and privation. Before the four expeditionaries had been split up, however, they made a pact to meet back at the same spot 1 year later. It was an ambitious thing to do, frankly. Every day that they were in captivity, their lives were in danger. From hunger, from mistreatment, from the state of war that prevailed over the countryside, from the countryside itself, which seemed to want nothing more than to stab, bite, or poison any two-legged creature wandering through it. And yet somehow, all four of the old expeditionaries survived that awful year. And so as the summer of 1534 came to a close, their respective bands began to move back into the great prickly pear ranges, perhaps in and around modern-day Brooks County, Texas. Even then, it wasn't going to be easy for these four men to reconnect. South Texas is a big, empty place without a lot of clear landmarks. Castillo, Dorantes, and Esteban's Indians were close enough to each other that the three had been able to stay in contact, and yet they had no inkling of where Cabeza de Vaca was, or even if he was still alive as the date approached. Then, on or around September 1st, 1534, they saw smoke coming from another native camp. They drew closer with their band, and soon they found their intuitions confirmed. In that camp, they found Cabeza de Vaca, and immediately they set to planning. This time, they weren't going to let the opportunity slip them by. They needed to get moving while the prickly pear harvest held out, and so the four men agreed that 13 days from then, on the date of the full, as they called it, ecclesiastical moon, They would meet at a designated point and begin their journey south, to the land of their countrymen whom they hadn't seen now in almost 6 years. And they made each other a promise, in the form of an ultimatum, really. Any one of the four who didn't appear at the stated date and time would be left behind. And so then on the anointed day, if not perhaps even a half day sooner, Cabeza de Vaca snuck away from his Indians and picked his way through the brush under the light of the full moon. Later that evening, Dorantes and Esteban found him, though showing signs of fresh abuse at the hands of their keepers, a band that called themselves the Camones. And it wasn't just a physical beating that had left Dorantes and Esteban shaken up. Dorantes and Esteban had finally learned the fate of the last fifth raft of that pathetic flotilla with which they had departed the Florida coast back in 1528. The fifth raft had drifted on for days longer than the others, and ended up beached somewhere along southern Padre Island. Quote, they had been so famished that even though they were being killed, they did not even defend themselves, and the Indians finished them off, end quote. The Indians who had finished them off were the Camones, who had proudly told Dorantes and Esteban what they had done, and even as proof showed them some of the clothes and weapons that they had taken off of their old companions. It was a frightening story for these four surviving expeditionaries to hear, just as they were about to make their escape across the land. Yet unlike the response of Lope de Oviedo, who a few years ago had turned back after he had received a beating and heard news of brutal treatment at the hands of Indians up ahead, Dorantes, Esteban, and Cabeza de Vaca weren't cowed by this. They used it as motivation to get moving. The problem, though, was that the fourth member of their party, Alonso Castillo, still hadn't shown up. The designated date and time passed, and the three expeditionaries present debated what to do. Despite their ultimatum, they didn't really want to leave a colleague behind. And so Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, and Esteban decided to postpone their escape for 1 day longer and moved themselves closer to a camp of some Indians that they believed might be holding Castillo. It was a risk, however, because this band was a historic enemy of the band that Cabeza de Vaca had been living with for the past year. Yet despite their historic animosity, these bands suddenly and for no apparent reason sought peace with one another. This had the effect of actually bringing the respective bands together, giving cover to the expeditionaries' movements. And sure enough, Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, and Esteban were soon able to confirm Castillo's presence in this camp. They were able to make their presence known to Castillo, and so, that night, the 13th of September, 1534, by Cabeza de Vaca's reckoning, Castillo broke away and joined the other three. With that, the plan was in motion. In Cabeza de Vaca's words, quote, we commended ourselves to God, our Lord, and fled, end quote. Using here that great word, encomendar, to signal how this time they were giving themselves over entirely to God, wherever He might choose to lead them. Just 2 days later, and still afraid that their old masters might be hot on their tail, the four expeditionaries saw a pillar of smoke rising from a camp up ahead. Recall, it had been a pillar of smoke rising in the air just a few weeks ago that had reunited the four expeditionaries. And these four weren't the type to disregard mystical signs. They, of course, couldn't know what tribe sat around the campfire at the base of that pillar of smoke, nor how that tribe might receive them. But for whatever reason, they decided to trust the sign and to follow it. As they drew nearer to the smoke, they came upon a single Indian traveling alone through the countryside. The Indian, of course, was initially fearful of the odd-looking quartet, and since he was probably conditioned to distrust most that he encountered anyway, the Indian tried to run away. And at this moment, in author Dennis Herrick's words, Esteban saved a lot of them. A so-called black Arab from Morocco, Esteban had come to the New World as the slave of Andres Dorantes. The ordeal of the previous 6 years, however, had dissolved much of the distinction between master and slave, and Esteban had emerged as a trusted and crucial part of the expeditionary's strategy for moving forward. Because Esteban, as we will see, possessed an unusual aptitude for languages, and an uncanny ability to communicate with many different kinds of people. And here is where we really start to see this. Esteban followed after the lone Indian, calling out to him in various languages, trying to calm him and signal to him that the 4 expeditionaries meant him no harm. It worked. The Indian stopped and allowed Esteban to catch up with him. The two conversed, and eventually the Indian agreed to lead the castaways into the next village. Whatever it was, Esteban must have said something to this lone Indian that radically changed the way that the 4 expeditionaries would be received by native communities from this point forward. I mean, there's no reason why these Indians shouldn't have viewed the 4 as anything but beggars and potential slaves as well, no differently than any other tribe that they had encountered before. Yet something was different this time. This time, they didn't just show up and ask for mercy. This time, they showed up as someone important, as people who might be of value to the tribe. Now, the 4 expeditionaries were medicine men. Maybe Esteban came up with this idea on his own. Maybe it was something premeditated in advance by the 4 of them. And interestingly, I think it is worth mentioning that September 13th, the date that Cabeza de Vaca states was the date of their escape, and another impossibly precise date, given that he hadn't seen a proper calendar in 6 years by this point, is the feast day of St. John Chrysostom, the patron saint of preachers. Again, maybe that's reading too much into it. Because maybe, in fact, it was the natives who, for whatever reason, saw something in the 4 that fulfilled some part of their own mythology. Maybe they had heard of the 4 expeditionaries. Cabeza de Vaca gives us a hint to this effect, quote, since they had already had news of us and how we were curing and of the marvels that our Lord was working through us, end quote. In either case, when the 4 expeditionaries arrived to this native village somewhere in South Texas, led by Esteban and their lone Indian guide, they were greeted enthusiastically by the inhabitants of the village. Avavares, they came to learn they called themselves. There's another interesting detail here as well in the housing arrangements that the Avavares offered the 4. Esteban and Dorantes, they singled out to be housed with one of their medicine men, which suggests to me that they thought Esteban and Dorantes perhaps the most powerful. Cabeza de Vaca and Castillo were also put up in a nice lodge, and immediately the treatment of all 4 improved. And this too might have been in the back of their minds, Esteban's or the 4 of them, when they decided to present themselves as medicine men. Even all the way back on Galveston Island, Cabeza de Vaca had noted that medicine men, or shamans, were rewarded quite lavishly by their patients in native North America. Lavish anyway by the standards of the resource-poor region. Yet even minor gifts of food or deer hides or anything like that might be what the 4 expeditionaries needed to be able to keep moving across the barren countryside. The transition in the expeditionaries' narratives from slaves to shamans is so sudden that, to me anyway, it seems unlikely that it was entirely planned. It feels like the expeditionaries would have taken more credit for it if it was something that they had really thought through. More likely than not, a bunch of things just came together at the right time and in the right way to reveal to them the course that they needed to follow. Maybe that's what divine intervention looks like. Not a burning bush, but the subtle coincidence of a bunch of factors that all seem to favor a similar outcome. Of course, the challenge with building yourself up as a medicine man is that eventually you have to start healing people. And no sooner had the expeditionaries settled into their lodgings than the Avavares put them to their first tests. On the next episode of Cabeza de Vaca. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and think this is a story worth sharing, please tell one friend. And if you haven't already, please go rate and leave a review for us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out the webpage associated with this episode on therivardreport.com, home of nonprofit journalism for a better San Antonio. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. The music for this series is entitled Apache. It was composed by Kevin Graham and is available on Soundstripe. A special thanks to Father David Garcia, to Dr. Frank de la Teja with the Texas State Historical Association, to to Steve Davis, curator of the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University, to Professor Andres Resendez at the University of California, Davis, to Dr. Carolyn Boyd with the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center and also Texas State, and to David Dunham with Texas Monthly for all their support and suggestions. You'll hear more about them throughout the season. And for more information about us and our other projects, you can check out our website at www.brandonseale.com.